Can you hear me? I was asked to speak into the mic. We were asked to speak into the mic. Um, okay, so this first session is entitled Framing Oral Histories in Scholarship, Arts, and Activism. And there are going to be 3 papers, I think, yeah. And the first speaker is Sylvia Buchinsky from the University of Lausanne. And let me read Sylvia's bio. So, born and raised in Frankfurt, Germany, Sylvia is a research assistant and PhD candidate in the field of anthropology of travel and tourism at the Institute of Geography and Sustainability, University of Lausanne, since 2016. After her master's in anthropology, University of Vienna, she worked as a research assistant at the Medical University of Vienna Department of Ethnomedicine and International Health from 2012 to 2015, and mainly worked with international migration of health workers. Her PhD project explores the relationship between transnational mobility and Afro-German identities. For her research, she accompanies participants during their travels, and she does biographical interviews to complete this lived experience of traveling together. Her paper this morning is entitled Afro-German, Afro-pean, Afro-politan, the relation between travel and the practice and narration of diasporic selves. Sylvia? And I hope I got your last name correctly. Thank you.
So hi everyone, and thank you very much for organizing this conference. I'm really glad to be here, and especially to hear all of your talks after that one. So in my work, I'm interested in the relation between travel and identity, travel and the construction of self. The research is based in the field of anthropology of travel and tourism, and aims to understand how socially and culturally constructed categories and hegemonic narratives of identity, for example of national identity, are negotiated, challenged, and transgressed by practices and narratives of mobility in connection with an Afro-diasporic identity in Germany. My departure point is that collective histories, identities, and diasporic consciousness are created through individual narratives as well as through practices. The practice of connecting with other diasporic cultural and political networks and people on a global level, like here today. In order to understand constructions of Afro-diasporic identities and the place that diverse forms of transnational mobility have in the lives of people of African descent in Germany today, I'm doing life story interviews. For my own empirical research, I work with 7 people for whom an Afro-diasporic and Afro-German identity is important for their understanding of self, and I focus on their life stories, on how they choose to narrate their lives, with a particular interest in the role of travel and mobility and how they negotiate belonging over space and time. Through narrated life stories, different times and places one person lives in, and the diverse people that matter or mattered in a life are related to each other in linear and non-linear ways. In their article on improvising and navigating mobilities in 2017, Amit and Knowles introduced the reader to the concept of spatial biography as a way to narrate a person's life, focusing on mobility in it. I use this concept in my research too. Here at that presentation, I choose to present to you only one of these spatial biographies from Oksana Chi, because for one, she's here and you can meet her at the conference, and also because her story fits well into the other 2 biographies that I will present briefly, the biographies of Ika Hügel-Marschall and Mai Ayim. They all 3 considered themselves as political activists and artists, which is an important part of their understanding of self. So what I want to do here today is first, I want to shed light on the importance of travel in the autobiographical writings of Mai Ayim and Ika Hügel-Marschall, and I want to link them to the biography of Oksana Chi, also an Afro-German artist that I work with empirically. By linking these very diverse and complex biographies, the aim is to contribute to an understanding of Afro-German identities in a larger context that do not only differ over space, place, and time, but that also differ over personal biographies, histories, or professional choices. But all of these very personal histories are also part of more collective histories of Black diasporic movements to and from Germany. So the narration of personal life experiences plays an essential part in the construction of Afro-German activism since the 1980s movement. Within these narrations, the quest for Black, African, or Afro-American roots and origins in a double sense hold a special place. First, the individual's quest for Black family origins outside Germany, and second, a collective quest for a shared history of African and Black presence in Germany. Ika Hügel-Marschall and Mai Ayim are related to an African or Ghanaian and Black US-American diaspora in Germany born in 1945 and 1960, and to whom destinations like Ghana, the Caribbean, and the US are important because of unknown family history, as well as a desire to reconnect with one's own sense of Blackness, which is self-defined and not imposed from the outside. So how do Ika Hügel-Marschall or Mai Ayim include the places visited and the people met in the narratives of their own lives? In her book, in her autobiography, Daheim unterwegs, Ika Hügel-Marschall describes how through the connection with other Afro-Germans she was able for the first time to forge a very self-confident form of belonging in Germany because she could identify with other Afro-Germans. In this group, she felt for the first time that it was normal to be German and Black. In the second half of her book, Ika Hügel describes her travels to the US and to the Caribbean and how these affected her sense of self and her sense of belonging. In the US, where she was at the age of 46, finally able to meet her father and family. She describes the experience of meeting her father and his family in Chicago as the end of her journey, I quote, in a poem, and I quote it. I reach out my hand, reach out to my Black family, my father, my family. Here at the end of my journey, here the whole world flows together. And the second important travel that she mentions in her life is the travel to St. Croix, to the Caribbean, to meet Audre Lorde and her partner, where she experienced for the first time in her life being in a place where being Black was the norm. The place and its people transmit to her a feeling of being one amongst many others, a feeling she does not know like this from Germany. Here on the Caribbean island, she feels safe from negative racial discrimination. It will become a place that she will travel to every year. And for Mai Ayim, amongst many other travels that she made, Ghana and South Africa hold a special place. They are mentioned in her essay collection, Grenzenlos und Unverschämt, that also exists in English, I believe, a posthum publication of 1997. So in 1986, Mai Ayim goes to Ghana for a few months. The motive of a quest for family origins becomes only discreetly apparent in her travel. Ghana is a place for Mai Ayim that she associates with an unknown family history. She associates Ghana until then only with her father, to whom she has a difficult relationship. The travel is supposed to give her another sense of the country, beyond that of her father. She decides to take part in a development project to be able to be in more intensive contact with people from Ghana, a contact that goes beyond the consuming tourist. She will meet her grandfather there for the first time, the father of her father, and the fact that he will accept her without condition as family member will be something she remembers forever. And she writes, "Here I was, standing in front of my grandfather. He was 80 years old, I was 26. When I entered his house, he came to me with open arms and hugged me, as if I was his most beloved granddaughter." In 1991, Mai Ayim travels to South Africa for research and studies. She has worked in an anti-apartheid movement for many years by then. On a festival in South Africa, Johannesburg, she recites the poem Afro-Deutsch about her experiences in Germany. She shares her feelings and experiences about the unification and growing racist attacks in the 90s. The political perspective of Blackness in South Africa that she was not able to find like that in Germany until now was very appealing for her. The more politically defined category of being Black, being a Black community based on shared experiences of marginalization, racial discrimination, and othering, came close to what Mai Ayim had in mind for her life and work in Germany. She translated her experiences abroad in the anti-apartheid movement in Berlin into her role as a founding member of the Black German movement. The travel and the ongoing connection with South Africa allowed my aim to create a self-understanding as Black activist and to renegotiate her understanding of Black as a politically active global community of Afro-descendant people. So the life story narratives of the two Afro-German authors are an example of the understanding of selfhood as embedded in social, political, and historical environments, and the entanglement and development of self with others. Both had to very actively create and search for role models and positive images of Blackness, of Africanness in and outside Germany, to create a rootedness in a diasporic self as African, Ghanaian, Afro-American, and German. The stories also show how important mobility and changing places can be for perceiving the self. So another biography that I want to talk about today is Oksana Cheese. Oksana is also here together with her partner Laila Sami, and tonight they will perform. And they are also the reason that I can be here today in the first place, because I met them in New York and then we traveled together to Toronto to this conference. And they told me about this conference also. Oksana is a dancer, artist, and Afro-feminist activist with East Nigerian, East European origins. When I met her for the first time at a conference on the theme of Afro-Europeans in Finland in 2016, I went to talk to her and Laila after their performance and told her about my project to work on travel and identity. She seemed to like the idea because traveling was an inherently essential part of her life. We met again in November 2017, this time in Berlin, where Oksana and Laila lived. Sitting in an Italian restaurant over lunch in Schöneberg, where Oksana also holds a studio place for dance practice, Oksana tells me about her life recounted over the different travel experiences she made in her life. Travels in over 40 countries on all continents. She does not have the time to tell me about all of them this day, but there are several travels in her narration and all hold a special place in her life. They all add up to form her body memory, as she calls it, and they are also all included in her performative style as dancer and artist in one way or another. So what I want to do now is to focus on only two of them to show how these places she traveled to had an impact on her life and self. For Oksana, travel has always been the norm. When she speaks about herself growing up, travel is part of it, first on a small scale as a child, then as a teenager already more in Europe, and then enlarging it to the world. Traveling was always in relation to certain people and to her activity as a dancer. They go together. And I quote her, "So I always went to the Black Forest and Switzerland, often on my own, when I was 10 or so. And therefore this being mobile, traveling, going somewhere, anywhere, at first within Germany and Switzerland, and then when I was a little more independent with 15 or 16, it extended to Europe. Back then I never traveled alone, always with friends or acquaintances. And then later, I began traveling to the US with 20, US, India, and then Asia. In order to follow her passion for theater and dancing and her thirst for culture, staying in a place like Bochum, where she went to school, was not enough. In a dance theater with 17, she met people from all over the world. With about 17, I lived in a dance theater, she says. In one room, there was a pianist from the Caribbean and a few dancers from France. That was in Düsseldorf. From Bochum, I went to Dortmund and to Düsseldorf. I moved a bit, because everything was too narrow. Yes, it's important to note that things easily get too narrow for me. Bochum was quickly too small, and I didn't know what to do in such an industrial city, especially regarding the cultural program. The theaters were not my cup of tea, and I already knew that I wanted to do something with theater when I was 14 years old. The dance theater belonged to an Afro-American artist in Düsseldorf, a city which had a bigger theater scene. Already in her life in Germany, transnational contacts played a major role for her personal and professional development. I moved in this dance theater, she says, that belonged to an Afro-American, and there I met many international people because he always had scholarships and funding. So there were always artists from France, and all kinds of people lived there and produced pieces with him. After that, she went to Folkwang-Schule, the artistic school in Essen, in the Ruhr area, where she learned modern and classical ballet. But soon that was also too narrow, as she explains, too German for her, whose development has always been influenced internationally. So again, that was too narrow, she says. With their focus on classical ballet, and the modern classes were not for me either. But I have to say that I had already trained with international artists, and then to be again in such a German education. And well, I thought it was weird to hear from the teachers, and now forget everything you learned until here. Although I had just learned so much from an Afro-American artist. And then they stand before me and tell me to forget everything and to do their movements that are maybe not fit to my body because I am also Afro, you know? And I was eager to learn. I told them I love German Ausdruckstanz and also appreciate ballet a lot. I want to learn it, but I also want to keep what I learned so far. It wasn't international enough for me. There were a few foreigners, but as I said, it was very German boring, but German in the sense of boring. And I didn't like it. I wanted something modern. I wanted to develop in direction to the future, not directed towards the past. I believe what Oksana's words tell us here, when she uses words such as modern or boring, it relates to the fact that the dominant narrative of Germany likes to consider itself as culturally homogeneous, not taking into account the various international influences that always existed and shaped Germany since forever. In the US, for example, it's a normality that international influences shape the country in many ways. This is also the case in Germany, but the dominant narrative still holds on to an essentialist view of the nation state that is based on the idea of a cultural, linguistic, or racial community, as Brubaker analyzes. Oksana has discovered the power of traveling, a sort of coming of age, during her first travel and road trip to India, after being a dance student for many years in Essen and Düsseldorf. This travel was like an eye-opening moment in her life. Oksana associated her travel to India to learning process, learning how to travel and to not be afraid. So I stayed with that opera singer, she said, from Cologne. She was an Aussteigerin, a person who opts out of society, and who was in Kerala to study Kathak dance and chant. And how did you meet her? Well, I always meet people. I just talked to her one day and asked her if she was German. I could see that she was. Really? Yes, I just had to ask her. And then we became friends. I told her I was a dancer, that I was from Germany, and that my sister also sang. So that was the first time that I made such a huge travel. And this first travel was kind of an eye-opening. A lot of crazy things happened. And after that travel, it was clear to me, now I have such a power. Now I can travel everywhere. After that travel, she moved to Berlin, also an important place in her life and work. That travel to India marked her life and career. That is where she began to learn dance and performance from all over the world that she would include in her own style. The medium of dancing was always something that brought her closer to the people in the countries she traveled to. She returned to India 2 years ago. That's the second travel. Almost 30 years after her first travel there. Now, to not learn anymore, as she said, but to perform. With Laila, they performed I Step on Air, the dance piece that they will also show here. A dance piece dedicated to Mai Ayim, the Afro-German poet and iconic figure of the Afro-German feminist movement of the 1980s. They performed on a queer theater and dance festival in Delhi. The showing of her piece, that she choreographed from her own perspective, with her background, her socialization in Germany as an Afro-German artist who deals creatively with the life of Mai Ayim, created new connections. During our interview in Berlin, at a later point, I asked her again about the performance I Step on Air in Delhi. I asked her, when you told me that you had shown I Step on Air in Delhi, you told me that it was interesting for you that they organized it into ragas, which means, as I understood, different moods and emotional states. And that for you, your socialization in Germany also played a role in how you conceived the piece? Yes, exactly, she said. Because I Step on Air is dedicated to Mai Ayim, and Mai Ayim did a lot here in the academic realm in Berlin. Mai Ayim was an activist, an artist, a researcher, and for many also a spiritual person to look up to, who gives you input. Unfortunately, she died early, and since then there are initiatives to remember her with different projects. I dealt a lot with Mai's biography, but even more with her poems, when she travels to Ghana. I Step on Air is dedicated to Mai Ayim, but it's also dedicated to traveling, how she comes back, how you are in different worlds, how you go from one world to another and experience things. So the feedback that she got from the people she met in India and Delhi that time enabled a more global vision of her piece. And that is, as she says, what she likes most, experiencing how things are seen and interpreted in other countries and places and by other people with different backgrounds, how the pieces are interpreted with other frames of reference, cultural references at hand, but that still make sense. In I Step on Air, that also includes a political message for the rights of people of color in Germany, Oksana talks about the ways that the struggles in Germany can be linked to different but comparable struggles in India. As she, Mai Aim, was a political person, the piece is also about politics, how we are invited and then outvited again, as people that are binational, but also how to use the strengths from both worlds and to connect them, but also how to use the strengths to connect them, how we get in and outvited, and how people make promises to us, and then we think, now we go forward. And then again, we realize it's on hold. And I asked her, with we, do you mean binational or we? With we, I mean in this context from my I am the Afro-German movement or the POC movement in Germany. Together they try to reach a bigger audience for people with migration backgrounds and for things to get more modern, that it's not always the same people that decide everything. And that is all included in I Step on Air. And I think they do understand that in Delhi, because they do have a lot of class struggles, and they had the caste system, and there are a lot of migrants in Delhi because there are many who come north to work. They understood that piece well. So that's only a tiny glimpse of the travels that Oksana made and that were important for herself and also for her development as an Afro-German artist. Traveling and living in diverse places around the world is intimately linked to her understanding of self as mobile in the sense of existential as well as geographical mobility. This mobility also produces a sense of homeliness that is detached from geography and which is deeply rooted in an understanding of being able to create home wherever she goes, through activity, dancing, and with her partner Laila. Transnational travel has become a condition to build and practice community in a double sense, experiencing a globally entangled Afro-diasporic and feminist community, as well as relating to and building a global network with dancers, performers, and researchers. Thank you very much for your attention.
Our second speaker is Daniel Williams. Daniel is assistant professor in the Department of Sociology, as well as co-director of the Critical Studies of Race and Ethnicity program at St. Catherine University in Minnesota, USA. His main interest is in the relationship between race and national identity in global and comparative perspective, with a focus on Europe, the USA, and Latin America. He has done ethnographic research on integration courses in Germany, as well as on the second generation in citizenship. His current work focuses on colorblindness discourse in the European context, global and transnational Blackness, and transformations in racial classifications and identities in the US. His paper is entitled Constructing Black German Identities Through Local, National, and Global Blackness, Germany from a North American Perspective. Daniel?
Good morning. I'm delighted to be here with so many new faces and so many possibilities for learning from each other about thinking about Blackness in a global and national and German perspective. Wait until this. So I'm going to talk today about some research I've conducted in Germany last year, interviews with several individuals who identify as Black German, and I guess in true academic style, I've changed the title of my presentation somewhat. And first of all, I had to remember where I was, and that is in Canada, not in the United States. So I've changed my title from North American to US. suitably. I have a lot to learn here today about, I look forward to the panel on Black Canadian experiences, and we have, I think, a lot to discuss about these differences. And the main focus that I have today is on the difference between the national and the global, and national and global Blacknesses. Okay. So my question and my interest today is in thinking about Blackness, racial categories, and the color line as national versus global constructions. It comes out of a comparative perspective that I've been working on, which obviously has taught us that Blackness is not the same across national boundaries. At least state ideologies of Blackness are not always the same. For instance, in the US, we've had an explicit system of racial classification and categorization, beginning with slavery and following with numerous things such as the US Census, which clearly categorized Black people as Black. And unlike Latin American countries where there has been a state ideology of mestizaje or mixed race state ideology that has co-opted and included in a very problematic way Black people and Blackness in its national identity. Why is this important? I want to explore this as a basis for how the interviewees that I talk to narrate their sense of being Black, and how the state categories may influence how people talk their way into and out of being Black German, or being Black in a global sense, or Black in some other sense other than that. And in my discipline, sociology, a lot of discussion has been around what is taking place in the US, which is evolving, according to some scholars, namely Eduardo Bonilla Silva, from a biracial to a triracial stratification system. A very technical term, perhaps, but the point that I think that argument is making is that the US is becoming increasingly like Latin America, where there is an intermediate group of people who would identify as neither quite Black and neither quite white. And there's a whole set of questions that, that are brought up by that question. So the interviews that I conducted with 7 individuals, which I'll highlight today, I wanted to first of all understand how they understood Blackness. How did their Blackness matter in their everyday lives in Germany, or Austria, as one of my informants is from Austria. But I also thought that there's much here that reveals something about Germany more than about the individuals themselves. And so I'm not trying to make a choice about sort of which is more important, but I think that when we look at how people narrate their senses of Blackness, we learn a lot about what the state has, how the state has defined Blackness, and then the strategies, the strategic narratives that they construct in order to deal with that. And what another thing that comes out of these interviews is the way that gender intersects with race, and I'll talk about how that specifically took place. So, so in this moment, global Blackness has become once again prominent, most clearly in the growing Black Lives Matter movement, which we see is almost ubiquitous around the world. We see Black Lives Matter Paris, Black Lives Matter London, Black Lives Matter Berlin, and I think there's a lot to say about that. So my question is about the tension between these two kinds of Blackness, if you will, right? That there's a global discourse on Blackness that might presume a commonality across different nation states, right, or homogeneity, right? And then there's the national Black narratives that can be quite distinct, but there's also quite a bit to discuss there about the political implications of those two perspectives. The categorizations have consequences for how people narrate their senses of self, but they also have consequences, as noted by scholars of social movements. So if we look at Brazil, for instance, the Black movement in Brazil's highest task, one of their most difficult tasks, is to actually convince brown people that they're more like Black people than they are like white people, right? So in other words, it's the constitution of people who are already Black by another national standard into being black people that is part of the task of the movement itself. So, and that I would say is a direct consequence of Brazil's myth of racial democracy that has created that ideology that says that there are brown people and there are black people and they're quite different. So this is important for thinking about how people construct black identities and what those, and that in turn has influence on when thinking about black social movements. So let me jump in with perhaps the thing that is the most obvious that comes out of these interviews, and that is the question of Germanness. In pursuing this project, I was more interested, or these short set of interviews, I was more interested in Blackness, but in fact it ends up shedding a great deal more light on Germanness, and it's difficult to talk about those two things separately in this context. So, but these are three examples of interviews of individuals who I asked in terms of how do they identify themselves or how do they experience their blackness in everyday life. And Jay's statement, which I'll read part of, says, essentially, really references the question, what I'm coming to call the question, where are you from, right? There's no other way to say this, and I'm almost apologizing for boring you with that point, because it's so much a part of the black German experience from what I've witnessed, right, is to be asked the question, where are you from? As I've titled my paper, from a US perspective, right, when we ask the question, well, how do we make sense of that question from a US perspective? I think one of the answers is to say that that question seldom is asked of African Americans, because people know where African Americans are from in the bigger sense of things, right? If we think about that question as a reference for thinking about people being from somewhere, that question is almost never asked of African Americans, almost never. But it is asked of Asian Americans. It is the Asian American question. And Mia Tuan and other scholars have called this the problem of the forever foreigner, right, of Asians in the United States, Asian Americans in the United States. And not surprisingly, Asians are arguably the group that occupied exactly the position that non-whites in Germany have occupied of being excluded from citizenship and nationality, right? So when we look at Asian Americans in immigration history in the US, they are essentially the group that is most targeted for exclusion from immigration, right? Between 1882, the Chinese Exclusion Act, in 1943, and actually kept out of citizenship as nationality, not necessarily rights. And so the question of the assumption of foreignness on the part of Asians makes sense and grafts onto the German narrative of foreigners as being non-whites, even though this question and the exclusion of black Germans from citizenship has been, I think, quite different than it has for Turkish or Arab or other minorities in Germany. So, and of course, the notion that Germany is a raceless state, where does it fit into this idea, into these schemes of racial categorizations? It's right in line with the continental European practice of not collecting data on race, right? Of adopting a color blindness approach that is very much along the lines of what Latin American countries does, except that it does it through invisibility rather than through co-optation, right? So rather than saying that there's, oh yes, we're all black, right? In Brazil, people will say, well, I'm this and I'm that and I'm this. I'm a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And people who have a black grandfather will say that they're white on the Brazilian census, whereas in Europe, France, Germany, and other Central and Western European countries do not collect data on race, and England is a notable exception there. The UK is an exception there. So what are the consequences of that? Well, it's obvious that race is real, no question. That's almost an unnecessary statement, and its ubiquity and importance in locating individuals is attested to by Jay's statement, who says that this is the question she's always asked: where are you from? And more importantly, it references the sort of importance of getting this racial information from people in our otherwise meaningless interactions, right? So this is always the question, she says, even before somebody knows me, even before they know what I do, it's, right, they are asking me where I'm from before they even ask what I do, right? So the idea is much like Omi and Winant in racial formation, that one of the first things we want to know about someone is their race, right? And if it's not clear that I've not said that, I think the origin question is the race question in Germany. Asking the question, where are you from, is akin to asking someone what their race is. The second person here, who is Austrian, a woman, A, who identifies A, says, I identify myself as African because I don't feel at home in Austria where I am from, right? She does not feel at home where she is from. I don't feel at home. It's nice there, you're socially secure, but the feeling of being at home, I more have in Nigeria. Both of her parents are Nigerian. So. And finally, S, who's a man in his late 30s, said, I'm German, not because I want to be, but because I am born here, have a German passport, and my life is centered here. So I think both of these statements reflect something important about Germanness, right? On the one hand, we have with A, this identification not with Austria, despite her having grown up in Austria, and even talking about this second generation experience of being taken to parents' parties, right? Having the immigrant kid experience of being dragged to various, ethnic events and then being bored and uninterested, right? And with not that many trips to Nigeria. So, I mean, if we question the transnational position, we might find that she's actually not that transnational, right? But she still identifies more as Nigerian than as German. And S, who I think articulates another very common, or reveals a very common strategy of identification for Germans of color, and that is to define Germanness as this technical thing, right? That I have the passport, I was born here, the center of my life is here, mein Lebensmittelpunkt ist da, that's what he said. I don't know how to translate, maybe you guys can help me with that. But, so this idea of not claiming a black Germanness, right? But claiming a Germanness based on a lot of technical definitions that are not in anything but the passport itself. So I'll come back to this last quote, but I want to move on to a couple of other things. Okay, one of the things that I had not expected but should have, and in the interviews, was the reference, the way that race was embodied, right? The way that people talked about race as inhering in their bodies, and how that was the way in which they actually recognized their otherness within German context. So A, who is, again, the woman from Austria, talks about her being in high school, or the high school age, teenage years, saying, I had a toned athletic build. I was muscular and had a nice figure. But I always got the message that I was too fat, while my super skinny classmates who were white with no muscles, extremely thin, were the beauty standard. And it's still that way. I had problems with my bodily self-image and my figure, and when I look at photos from that time, I think, wow, you had a great body. But as a girl, I went on soup and cabbage diets. You're too fat, or my nose was too big, and this she emphasized, my voice was too loud. My voice was too loud. And at some point, I started to speak more softly, like those white girls. I was stunned by the resonance of this with what we know about the black women's experience in the United States, right? These kinds of ideas of the black female body as too masculine, as muscular, right? Of black women as too fat, right, or fat, and particularly the idea of black women as loud, right? This is sort of or black people as loud, which is, of course, very common in the U.S. Experience. And as Joy Lay talks about, those loud black girls and those quiet Asian boys, right? This is the kind of gendered and racialized way of looking at both girls and boys, and she really described what we could say is clearly a global construction of blackness here, right? That this is a way in which the black body is seen globally, not in any different way in the German context. And Jay talked about this as well with the same kinds of standards, right? I had my girlfriends in school and they could curl their hair and it was so easy. I couldn't wear their hairstyles. I didn't have straight hair. I didn't have the body type, right? So again, we see that the body is a very important site for constructing a sense of belonging. And I think that theoretically it raises a question of whether there's a possibility of having a German body as a black person, right? Or what it means to be the kind of black person who can be accepted through embodiment that is typically, or is understood as typically, white. That's something maybe we can discuss or revisit. What I think this looks like from the US perspective is that I think that there has been a history of, obviously there's been a history of degrading the black body, sexualizing, objectifying, and otherizing the black body. At the same time, there's a counter discourse of black bodies that goes back quite a ways that also inverts the relationship or the hierarchy between black and white bodies. Some of it is quite problematic, but if we look at the narratives of the black or the berry, for instance, right? Or if we look at the way that, you know, the song Doin' de Butt, which really was a way of reclaiming the black body in a positive comical sense, right? We're talking about an inverting of this notion of black beauty and white beauty, right? And of course, the whole, the Afro in the 1960s and black is beautiful, all of these ways of dealing with this degradation provide tools in the toolkit of black people, right, to actually potentially construct a different sense of self. What I thought stood out here was that both of these women initially compared themselves to their white German peers, that they didn't compare themselves to black German peers, at least not in these contexts they didn't, right? That was the first go-to for them. And I think there is research that shows that, in fact, black girls in the United States have higher self-esteem than white girls do, surprising to many. But in fact, I think that's something to think about in relation to these counter-representations of black bodies. Another thing that I found was that many of these, or a couple of these informants or interviewees claimed blackness, they reclaimed blackness in some ways through global connections, right? That they moved out of. And A here, who's the same woman who talked about being too loud and too fat, talked about how she went through a period of feeling depressed in high school, and that what brought her out of that were black authors, black American authors. James Baldwin, Alice Walker, Alex Haley. I read them all. She said that in English. The first part was in German. I, of course, read the classics too, like Charles Dickens. I read everything. But after a while, I had to follow my gut and read black authors. And the only black authors we had access to were American. I devoured it all, the history of slavery and everything else. It devastated me, but it also showed me the racism I have to deal with daily comes from somewhere, and it's not my fault that I'm treated a certain way or not, you know? And then G, who is also had an interesting narrative about calling herself Mischling, which is a term that has roots that other people in this room can talk much more eloquently about than I can. But she says about this term, which is considered derogatory by many and a way of talking about oneself as mixed. I never called myself Mischling before because the word had negative associations. But then after spending time online, watching YouTube videos in English, and everyone was calling themselves mixed, I just translated that back to German. So she had adopted this. She just called herself Mischling, thinking of it as the way people talk about mixed race or being mixed race in the US. I think I just have one more here, and there's a couple of other points, but I did try to do my best here with the translation. But another thing that I think was really interesting and is a question that I've seen come up in the scholarship on race, thinking about race in Germany and race in Europe, is where is the color line? And it's one of my initial concerns as I set out. Where is the color line in Germany in a context where perhaps 50% of those who are considered, you know, of migration background are, from a US perspective, would be considered white, right? Russian, Serbian, Eastern European. Where does the color line fall in the German context? And it was noted by two of these people that really the line is between those who are European and those who are not. So as A says here, you know, hey, as a black person, you can't just take off your skin color when you go out. For others, like if you had a Serbian who's blonde and blue-eyed, she can go out and she doesn't have to speak Serbian, right? She just needs to speak German, and the Austrians will see her as one of theirs, right? So, and one other person talked about this in a very interesting way that I think will be my last point in terms of thinking about how race is constructed in the German context. She talked about the social separation, right? Social space and how people enter spaces with strangers, right? She says it's really noticeable when strangers meet, then migrants form a group and the bio-Germans, which we can talk about, form a group. Even when the migrant group is mixed, you know, but somehow when you walk into a room and have the choice, migrants go to migrants, and suddenly Turks and black people are friends, you know? So she also talked about her own friendship circles being made up of Germans of color, and that in the course of talking about that, she mentioned Muslims, which is very interesting in terms of thinking about the ways that these different categories in fact overlap or are thought of as being essentially replaceable for one another. So in conclusion, I think there's a lot here that I'm still working on and thinking through, but I think that what much of this shows is there's a couple of thoughts I have on it. One is that, of course, global blackness is a way out of the lack of recognition of oneself within the nation state, although I'm quite sure that there are many counter-black German identities that I'm still unfamiliar with that would be constructed. The state is not the ultimate determiner of one's identity, but it is an important determinant in it. So I look forward to discussing more, and thank you very much.
And our final presenter is Karina Griffith. Karina is a PhD candidate here at University of Toronto Cinema Studies Institute, where her research on Black authorship in German cinema interacts with theories of affect, intersectionality, and creolization. Her films, installations, and curatorial practice explore the themes of fear and fantasy, often focusing on how they relate to belonging. In 2017, she curated a 3-month-long festival, Republic Repair, 10 Points, 10 Demands, One Festival of Repertory Imaginings from Black Berlin at the Post-Migrant Theater Ballhaus. I'm not going to say the last part because that's going to be difficult for me. Her writing can be found in Women in German Studies special online section on race and inclusivity, Berlin Art Link, and Shadow and Act. Karina is currently the district studio grant holder for the project Decolonizing 68 in Berlin, and Karina's paper is entitled What is Producing for Us? Karina?
Hello, everyone, and thank you. I'm one of the co-organizers of this festival. Still, I would like to thank my co-organizers because I must agree with everything that was said before. It is quite a lot of work to put this together, and especially to Angelika Fenner, it's just been a pleasure to work alongside you and for you and to have you as a mentor. Okay, so an opportunity presented itself to present, and after hearing these two last presentations, I'm really glad that I took it up. So what I'll be sharing with you today is sort of part of the introduction of my dissertation on Black authorship in German cinema, affect and mobility. There's quite a few intersections with what we've heard before. And here is the much needed subtitle, What is Producing for Us? Black German Film Producing Against the Machine. So, on July 5th, 2017, Black Austrian author and producer Tyrone Ricketts posted an open letter on his Facebook page announcing his return to Berlin after 5 years working in the United States with Harry Belafonte. Der neue deutsche Film, oder wie das Pferd von der Maschine ersetzt wurde, translation, the new German film, or how the horse is replaced by the machine, is Ricketts' survey of the German film and television industry. Ricketts, who has starred in Kanakatak and the series Soko Leipzig, takes the position of an engaged observer, calling for structural change, pointing to digital networks as the way forward, and highlighting the work of colleagues who stand ready to take on a bigger role on German screens. So this paper explores the similarities between Ricketts' essay and Med Hondo's 1979 manifesto, What is Cinema for Us? Hence the title, published in Framework, a British film theory magazine covering third cinema. In common with Ricketts, Hondo is an actor as well as a filmmaker. Born in the North African country of Mauritania, Med Hondo started his film career as a voiceover artist, most famously the French voice for Eddie Murphy and Morgan Freeman. In 1966, he started the theater group Shango, and the influences of the stage aesthetic can be seen in the mise en scène of his seminal debut film Soleil Haut, and most prominently in West Indies, The Fugitive Slaves of Liberty. At the time of its making in 1979, West Indies was Africa's most expensive film with a budget of $1.3 million US. So both Ricketts and Hondo's essays point out that the measures that deem whether a film production is successful are stacked against the Black auteur. This paper investigates what is at stake when we compare the situation for Black filmmakers in Germany to that of African filmmakers in the years after colonialism. According to Distastis, which is the Federal Statistic Office, there are approximately 740,000 people with African descent living in Germany. So, is the German funding model a neo-colonial system in terms of image production? How are Black filmmakers in Germany making films in spite of this, and what is producing for us? Hondo calls the African viewers of European cinema on the continent co-producers of European films and the miserable state of Black cinema. He states that multinational film companies at the time were earning 50% of their profits from distribution in the global South. In his view, African spectators were supporting a type of colonial extraction. Quote, each year, millions of dollars are harvested from our continents, taken back to the original countries, and then used to produce new films, which again come to our screens, end quote. So Ricketts didn't make the jump between television to film in his essay, but the two are very much linked. Film funding in Germany is tied to television contracts. In 2011, more than half of the feature films in Germany had a TV partner as part of their financing. Some state and federal film subsidies receive contributions from the broadcasters as well. The Arbeitsgemeinschaft Fernseh Filmforschung, AGF from now on, is a partnership of the TV stations ARD, Pro7 Sat.1, RTL Media Group Germany, and ZDF. These television broadcasters in Germany rely on ratings to determine their investments. So since 1985, the AGF commissions the international marketing research company GfK to monitor the daily television habits of a sample of 5,000 households in Germany. So until 2016, the criteria for participating in this 5,000 household sample was German or EU citizenship. But now, focus group members can have any citizenship, but the main earner in the household must be German speaking. Tyrone Ricketts takes issue with this in his essay. And I see I have the same impulse as my colleagues Sylvia and Daniel to provide you with long quotes. I think I really want his voice to speak. So I'm gonna read my translation. Usually, the first device in the house is measured, not what maybe the partner in the bedroom or the offsprings in their rooms watch. Not included are households where the main earner is non-native speaking German, or people who see their program on the computer outside the 24 hours after the TV broadcast in the media library. This quota, which no longer represents a truly representative cross-section of our population, thus becomes an almost impenetrable bottleneck for TV productions and their makers with a modern and innovative cosmopolitan approach. This has the effect that predominantly formats are produced that are tailored to the interests of the voting group, German, old, and male. Unconventional projects that have little chance of prevailing. The creative development of the German television landscape is inhibited, and people who do not promise a positive response to said group are marginalized in the programs. I myself have heard several times that one fears that the ratings of a show with a non-white lead actor would fall into the basement. So, what do the criteria for the AGF sample size mean for Black German film production? What do the regulations say about the institution of German television production and funding? So the AGF uses two methods to choose the sample. One is a random route procedure, and the other is a quota procedure. The random route procedure ensures geographic diversity, while the quota procedure ensures that certain groups are represented. Characteristics such as level of education, age, and sex are taken into account, but missing from the quota are priorities such as ethnic diversity. So it's unclear how the AGF determines whether a person is German speaking. The questions I have are the interviewers required to administer a test? Is the test objective, following the common European framework reference, levels A1 to C1? Is it subjective, allowing pronunciation with a foreign accent to play a role in the interviewer's evaluation? Is a non-German sounding name enough for a family to be eliminated at this random stage? So the language requirement does not in and of itself eliminate people with Migrationshintergrund, migration background, from the sample. It goes without saying that Black Germans are indeed German speaking. The Black community itself is diverse, a realization that prompted the Afro-German organization ISD to change its name from Initiative Black Germans to Initiative Black People in Germany, which includes somebody like me some years ago. Many Black immigrants to Germany speak German, but perhaps as a second, third, fourth, or fifth language. However, and this is the crux, one does not need to prove that they are German speaking before paying the monthly broadcasting fee. And this probably serves a bit of explanation. So in Germany, there is a monthly broadcasting fee, which everybody has to pay. You can't get around it. If you own a television or a radio or a computer, I think even if you're walking around with a smartphone, you have to pay this. So the ARD and ZDF, Deutschland Radio fee, is formerly called the GEZ, secures the financing of public broadcasting. The criteria for mandatory contribution, as I said, it costs around €17.50, so maybe, how much is that in Canadian? It's a lot more in Canadian. So the criteria is simply having a television, radio, or computer in your household. And the broadcasters ARD and ZDF are both members of this AGF Media Research Company. So, and here I just want to say, living in Germany, certain things that are mandatory and regulations, it's really hard normally to navigate if you're not a German speaker. However, the information for the fact that it's mandatory to pay this $20 is in so many languages. Look at this accessibility. We've got English, French, Espanol. I mean, there is no way that you can use the excuse that you're not German speaking to get out of paying this $20 every month. So, as the situation stands, a household with a family that is not considered German speaking is forced to contribute to a system that is unlikely to represent their point of view. So similar to the situation Medhondo describes, these communities are unknowingly co-producing a cultural system that systematically ignores their point of view. Medhondo refers to a system that labors for specific exclusion through perpetuating a set of cultural codes that project the African and Arab as other. Quote, "This alienation disseminated through the image becomes all the more dangerous for being insidious, uncontroversial, accepted, and seemingly inoffensive and neutral," end quote. So Ricketts, in speaking about the AGF requirements for the sample size, he makes the jump, as you heard, from German speaking to mother speaking German, Muttersprachliche Deutsch, and then to white, male, and old. And this is his personal experience as a producer and filmmaker in Germany and abroad, and informs his reading of these cultural codes. Now, there are many assumptions built into the AGF requirements. First, that non-German speaking people in Germany do not watch TV. Second, that the viewing habits of non-German speaking people in Germany does not provide information that would be valuable to broadcasters and producers. 3, households in Germany where the breadwinner is not German speaking do not have other German speaking members in the household. And finally, if households in Germany where the breadwinner is not German speaking do have other German speaking members in the household, that their viewing habits are somehow inconsequential. So let's break these down. First, this assumes that German television realm is a safe space for producers to represent non-German speaking characters, and without them seeing, and more importantly, without them being able to critique these portrayals. Perhaps this is an example or an explanation for the racist portrayals that pop up time and time again in German film and television, especially on Tatort, the false confidence that they are not watching. And so the second one, I mean, if non-German speakers are watching German television, and they are, then their choices about what they watch would be only valuable information for a broadcaster that is interested in being inclusive. And for 3 and 4, these two assumptions for me connect integration to a mastery of the German language in an effort to ignore families where members have Migrationshintergrund. It ignores not only first-generation Germans, but the second generation as well. So again, the German Federal Statistics Office indicates that there are 18.6 million, or over 22% of the country's population of 82 million, are first or second generation immigrants. So it is irrelevant if a Black German person speaks German perfectly. By virtue of their skin color, and I think this goes towards what Daniel was saying, by virtue of their skin color and the racism in Germany, they and their stories they tell will be deemed foreign. Hondo describes the participation of Africans and Arabs in the telling of their own stories as sovereign peoples, a responsibility. Producing for Black German filmmakers means community engagement, lobby work, and education. And Sherry Hagen yesterday is so very much involved in all of that. Unfortunately, constantly having to defend the right to author our own stories is part of what producing is for us. Ricketts insists that digital platforms provide a diverse audience for Black authored films, but it's questionable whether they will also provide funding, at least in Germany. The AGF recently paired up with an international marketing research company, Nielsen, to begin collecting data on video streaming. And while the sample size is much larger than what the AGF uses, so instead of 5,000, that sample is 15,000, the German-speaking requirement remains. However, thinking transnationally may very well be the way forward for Black German filmmakers, and I mean, this would be a whole other paper, but the recent blockbuster success of Black Panther, which is a German co-production, demonstrates that Black authorship is marketable and profitable. And this is an image from Each One Teach One's Black-only screening in Berlin for the premiere of Black Panther just in February. So in conclusion, both Hondo and Ricketts wrote their essays to coincide with a major turning point in their filmmaking careers. Hondo was making history with West Indies, and Ricketts was returning to Europe after a successful stint abroad. Each saw fit to reach out to their communities during this milestone and take a survey of the conditions of production for Black-authored cinema and television. Producing for us, in all of our diversity, involves creative workarounds to a funding system prejudiced against us, community support, and exhaustive lobby work. In the absence of Black filmmakers telling our own stories in the German media, mirrors some of the predicaments Hondo described in the African continent some 30 years ago. Ricketts' summation of the situation illustrates that Black and other voices are not considered important in terms of spectatorship, and that marginalizes the same voices on the production side. The horse is itself a machine, and we cannot replace it with a new one until it is in the interest of German institutions to make structural change. Change starts by asking everyone in Germany what images they want to see on their screens. Thank you.
We have lots of time for questions and conversation. I'm going to pass the mic right along because I don't have to speak, which is a good thing.
I mean, I wanted to be, I want to be very careful saying that because I'm sure that that's not true all the time, everywhere. But I think there's this way in which we think about, I mean, the question is sort of, because blackness is so clear in the US imagination, and I wouldn't say it's not in the German, but that it's sort of like nobody is going to ask that question. And I think what happens in the US is that ethnicity, this is one of the things I wanted to say in the midst of talking about all that, but didn't have time to, is that ethnicity is really a kind of a privilege in the United States. Race completely eclipses ethnicity for people of color. And it's interesting that actually being foreign for certain people of color is in fact a way to have more access to whiteness than if you are not foreign. So Mary Waters' work on Black identities in New York City looks at how, you know, the children of African and Caribbean immigrants actually signal their foreignness as a way of distancing from Black Americanness, right? And you know, there's other sort of more traditional sociological scholarship on the first generation, but the first generation Latino, the first generation Black immigrants or children of immigrants tend to do better when it comes to educational and other traditional, you know, measures of upward mobility. So I think there's something really interesting, maybe, and I think it probably comes from the US's, you know, fake narrative of itself as US, as a country of immigration, but that story keeps getting told, right? We're a country of immigration, we are, right? Everyone here came from somewhere except Native Americans, but of course, you know, the history of who was able to come here, there, right, is quite fractured. So I think it is a less common thing for African, yeah. Right. Right. Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Hi, this question is for Karina. I thought it was really interesting juxtaposition of Tyrone Ricketts and Medhondo. Medhondo is such an important figure, so I thought it was a brilliant juxtaposition there. But I do want to ask something about German television, and particularly in relationship to the film we saw last night, At a Second Glance. I'm wondering if that had television broadcast in Germany, and what is your reading of the reception of that film, you know, given the kind of media research issues that you were talking about in your paper? How does a film like At a Second Glance get on German television? How does it produce a larger possibility for Black producers in Germany?
I'm really glad you asked that question because it was something we didn't get into with Sherry Hagen yesterday, but short answer is it doesn't. So Sherry Hagen's film was not financed with television broadcast money, and it took a long time for her to bring it into fruition. She did mention yesterday that she had a very small budget, and what she didn't mention is it was shot, I think, in less than a week. So it was just a testament really to her skill and the skill of the actors, but it is a self-financed film. And this is exactly, I think, what is important to understand when we talk about these types of texts is that they're operating and being created in a way outside of a traditional German system. And this is why it's very interesting to look at also at models in terms of web TV and transnational models for creating films that then reflect these voices.
Another issue is this balance between access and intellectual property rights. And Sherry Hagen's film is on Vimeo. You can see it for $2, but other things aren't available. And so what's the discussion about that? I mean, people should be rewarded for their work, but then you put things up out there and then you're not getting that reward. So what kind of discussion is happening about that? And I'm thinking actually of Bronwyn Okpako, whose films are very inaccessible and very hard to get. And if you want to get them for your library or if you want to buy them, it's very expensive. And so how do you work with that?
That's interesting. I'm going to try and interpret your question. They are two different financing models. Maybe that has something to do with it, because Bronwyn, she did have a 3-film deal with, I think it was also ZDF, to make her Kleine Fernsehspiel, genau, to make her 3 films. So maybe that is why it doesn't have as wide access as somebody who's an independent producer and has all the rights and is able to say, okay, I'm going to use these alternative distribution models. But in terms of reward, if you mean financial reward, definitely. And another one of the texts that I look at is Emilia Umuhire's Polyglot. And I'm always asking her, when are we going to see the fourth episode of Polyglot? And she says, we're not, because she made it all, for free, bartering. It's a beautiful series, but it's not able to sustain her, so it ends there. Yeah.
Question for Daniel. I noticed that you're talking a lot about African American experiences and just considering the way that African American identity dominates the African diaspora. I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about that and how you're negotiating that in your work.
Yeah, let's see. When you say negotiate, do you mean me, myself, as African American, or do you mean how do I negotiate that particular narrative, and how do I work with it in the questions I ask and interpreting their responses? Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. 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 Yeah, I actually I'm interested in that and concerned about that. And I think some other scholars have done that kind of work on, say, France, for instance, right, and the sort of Black American presence in France. I mean, at the moment, that was sort of where, and I think it was in the title of that slide, was, the question of global or American Blackness, right? And, why is this the go-to, And I suppose even a very simple question is, why is so much of the global Black identity articulated in English, right? Why is it that racial profiling is said as in English in Germany and not often rassistische Polizeikontrolle, which I've started to hear. So I haven't systematically looked at that, but I do think that. So I mean, I guess my attempt is actually, what I'm actually trying to do is to pull apart global Blackness and to find out what it actually looks like underneath, because I am suspicious, and to all that I know so far, there is a clear African American hegemony within that, right, in which sort of Black American is kind of on the top of this heap of Blackness, right, where the rest of, and there's a romanticization of it. I mean, one of my early experiences in living in Germany as a person who identifies as mixed race and Black was always that being thought of as not Black enough for people in Germany, right, because I wasn't characteristically enough like the people that they had seen on television, right? And I heard that from some Black Austrians as well, not the person I interviewed here, but a long time ago when I was on the, on the Lonely Planet Thorntree, and I talked to somebody who was Black Austrian, she said, oh, we were so disappointed that you were so light, right? Light-skinned. So, I mean, there's a little personal anecdote here, but I do think that there's something very problematic in the way that this move towards being globally Black means being African American. So I'm concerned with it, and I'm not sure how to exactly address it yet with what I have so far, but thanks for the question, it's great.
I just want to comment, Daniel, that when people ask you that in the United States, they ask you, who are you, as opposed to where you're from. Different reframing of the question. But the question I have is about the person who called herself Micheling. And did doing that, I mean, in the United States, the issue of trying to reframe the N-word, I'm not so sure how successful that's been. So I was wondering if reframing Micheling has been very successful in Germany.
Yeah, I think that's a conversation we'd have to have in a larger group, I hope, because I think others can talk more about that term. But she was an interesting interviewee in the sense that so I did my interviews at the Bundestreffen, the Black community meeting. I should have said that just to be a little bit more, So I mean, this was a select group of people over a short period of time. And this particular person actually said in one of the meetings, well, I feel like I'm different because I'm mixed. And some other people disagreed and said, no, there will be no colorism here at this meeting. And I think I understood that position, but I think that she was, in the interview, other things that she said clearly showed that she saw herself as in solidarity with other Black people, right? That she wasn't trying to engage in a kind of like whiter than competition. So it could be that she's trying to reclaim it that way, but my sense is that it's kind of a little bit naive on her part, right? That she's just doing it because she does feel mixed and she doesn't have a word for it. And instead of using the English word or saying, I'm mixed, ich bin mixed or something, she's trying to just use a German word and redefine it. And I like your analogy of the N-word as a reclaiming of it, but I'm not so sure. I'm a little skeptical. But she was, she was in solidarity with other Black people, which was part of the questions that I also asked. So, yeah.
My question is for Sylvia. Got that right? Yes. It has to do with, maybe you could elaborate a little bit on the idea of the mobile self. I was very interested in your paper because I've had different travels but haven't reflected on them in that lens. And I just wondered, is it different for people who are not an artist to have that sense of mobile self? What would that be?
To the last bit of the being an artist, I think today in this world, if you are an artist, it's just it's part of your life is to be mobile, not only because you want to, but also because you have to, because you depend on scholarships. And for example, Oksana, she told me a few days ago that if you wanna stay as a dancer only in Berlin, well, that would be really difficult to have to really find a permanent job there. So mobility is kind of necessity also. That's sometimes good and sometimes not so good. But what I meant with the mobile self is I was also thinking about there's an anthropologist from Australia, Gassan Haig, and he develops on the self and he develops on the idea of existential mobility, and that for example he analyzed Lebanese migration Lebanese international migration, and reflects on the idea that the migration comes because people feel that they are existentially immobile, that they are not able to move forward, and that so geographical mobility comes after that. And in the case of Oksana, for example, I think that it goes together, that for herself, she really understands herself as not being stick to one place, but to live in different places, yeah, and work in different places and with different people. Thanks for the question.
I have a question, but also an observation from a couple of the last questions and responses. One having to do with an observation that in all of your presentations, and particularly that having to do with the film industry and also being mobile, the mobility issue and also that of access, and the underlying financial issues that come into play, being a part of a system and being outside of a system, and how much empowerment comes when you can connect to those outside of the system to develop your own system of being able to become mobile. And that's kind of in and of itself, a kind of a cyclical or global idea. And the thinking out of the box that Jen Hagen mentioned last night, how important that also is in the visibility of the work that people are doing and getting it out there. We're struck by the fact that in the question behind about access to the films and things that we want to use in if we're teaching or if we're presenting, that we want to use in our presentations and things, and how difficult they are to access. The point about, I wanted to ask Daniel and anyone else who'd like to respond to that. I am 7 decades of African American, and the 10th grade started to learn German and spent time in Germany. Going along at that time when I went back as a student, what I found was most Germans would ask me where I was from, but they would never guess the United States. I used to have I'm Native American too, so I had very long hair, and I even had an Oma and an Opa look into the window of a store one day when I was looking in it with a hood on with fur around it because it was cold, to say, Oma, ein Eskimo ist das. So things of that nature bringing to the fore that, in fact, you're different, but it also had to do with levels of your skin color and appearance, your hairstyle, all of those things. My thought and my question to you is, in the thinking that African Americans somehow seem to, the African American story dominates the whole question of the diaspora. I'm president and founder of the Georgiana Simpson Society for German Diaspora Studies. And in that, the idea of Georgiana Simpson, who at that time was even a name that was kind of unfamiliar to me, turned out to be the first African American woman in 1921, the year of my father's birth, to get a German philology degree from the University of Chicago, at a time when she was not allowed to live in the residencies on campus in order to get that degree. She found ways around that, and she got the degree. Today, the bust of Georgiana Simpson stands in a hall that is directly across from a plaque that is the norm to encapsulate the lives of former administrators, and she faces the very one who denied her the right to live in the residence. Those kinds of statements come out of our history, and because of the history, that coming all the way back from the Middle Passage and slavery, do you find in your studies that the history is the thread, that perhaps that and the fact that our history has been made so public, even though growing up in the days of segregation, there was very little that one could find about slavery in any history book. We took ownership at some point to tell our stories or to live them out and to exalt those people who were our scholars. We found in the founding of the work that we've been doing, this is my colleague, Dr. Hodges, that our group has found we have an enormous connection to a legacy of transatlantic legacy of African Americans in Germany in scholarship, Du Bois, Carter Woodson, and many others. And so I would say to ask you, do you find that that may very well be part of the answer to why it is that we are being held, as you say, maybe at the top of the heap? I've had students who come from the Caribbean, and in an exercise that we do to get away from where are you from, they will say, I am, and the question is, I am, but I am not. And they began to say now, I am from Mauritania, I am West Indian, but I am not African American. So even in making that distinction, it says a lot about how people are trying to get to where they can tell their own stories and be visible. So I'm asking you, do you find that perhaps that is part and part the answer, that our part of the diaspora has been out there a whole lot longer and we've experienced so many of the things that other people trying to empower themselves have experienced?
You said a lot there. It's a wonderful question. I appreciate the history that I didn't know. I'm not sure. I think that there's a whole history of African Americans in Europe that is. I mean, there's endless history there that I'm unfamiliar with. I know of Du Bois, of course, and others, Carter Woodson, and so on. But I feel that in the current moment, most of that dominance, if you will, is about the circulation of images of African Americans, right, and what's happening in America. And I would suspect that some of it also has to do with those ways, the way the state ideologies of race. So I came to this because in figuring out my dissertation project, I almost ended up studying Brazil. That's why I keep making references to Brazil. I didn't speak enough Portuguese, so I ended up in Germany instead. But you know, Brazilians went through this too in the 1970s even, when they embraced Black power, right? And so there's this whole, I mean, that played out in Brazilian music. There was a whole, you know, samba soul scene that happened in the 1970s, and they were watching blaxploitation films, they were watching Shaft, they were watching Superfly, and taking on this Black American identity because the only thing they had ever been given was samba, football, and you know, blacks is, you know, serving sort of this white Brazilian interest. And so I think that's what propelled people. I mean, I still think that plays a role somewhere in the midst of this. So I certainly wouldn't challenge any of the points you're making about that history, but I also wonder if the US's place in the global economy and in the global system of states is also not part of that story, right? I mean, Brazil is 200 million people. If you count the Browns in, there's 100 million people of Black people in Brazil, 100 million, right? And in the United States, we're 40 million, right? So, and so, I mean, why are we, you know, Nigeria has 130 million people. Why are we at the top of this? The only other thing I would throw in would be that I think that, lost my train of thought. I know what it was. It's that there are actually, it seems to me that there are remarkably fewer African Americans who seek out the Black diaspora in the same way that there would be people in the Black diaspora seeking out Black America, right? And there are very notable and important exceptions, right, to that. And, you know, so it's, and of course the structural inequality globally helps that to happen, right? Because we, you know, why should we? I mean, because America doesn't look to the rest of the world in general. So why should Black America be different? There are important exceptions, right? You know, African Americans who were communists and Marxists and went to Russia, you know, other expatriates, certainly those movements back to Africa and so on, and Black cosmopolitans and so on. So, but I'm not sure. So that's the best I can answer. Yeah.
Okay, I actually was going to say a lot of what you've already said in this question of the dominance of African American in the discussion on global race. And I think, not to be redundant, but you have to think about the United States and its dominance globally. I think that's the biggest thing. The other part of it, I think, is very important. My colleague here, who talks about the presence of African Americans in Europe. When I was in Germany in the 1980s, fact of the matter was, because of the Allied occupation of West Germany, Germans had to learn English. There were so many books that were translated, especially in terms of Black writers. It was, I mean, it was just unbelievable. I could go into a Kneipe somewhere and I'd meet someone and they want to have a conversation with me about Chester Himes. So the American presence globally has a lot to do with also the African American presence in the race discussion, and also the kind of leadership that was taken in the community against racism. And I also want to iterate that those folks, beginning with Du Bois, Baldwin, whomever, they never limited that discussion just to Black Americans. They were addressing international issues. That struggle was viewed as being liberation for Black people throughout the world. But the way people perceive it, of course, in Germany, they're going to go to English because that's their second language largely, and depending on the age of the Germans. So I just wanted to reiterate and reinforce what you've been speaking to here already.